live in a small, quiet town where nothing ever really happens. The kind of place where people leave doors unlocked and trust the dark. I shared a one-story house with my sister Marissa, though she was almost never home because she spent most of her time in Florida. I followed the same routine every night after work. Dinner, shower, silence, then a run. I did not realize it then, but routines are rules, and rules attract attention. That night after my run, I noticed a white van parked across the street, which felt wrong immediately because our block never had random cars. The houses were far apart and the woods across the road swallowed sound. I walked backward to my door pretending to stretch. Watching the van the whole time, I could tell someone was inside even though I could not see them. Looking back now, I should have gone somewhere else. Later, while inside, I heard a scraping sound outside. Slow and deliberate, like metal dragged with care. When I called out, the sound stopped too quickly, which unsettled me more than if it had continued. I told myself it was an animal or a neighbor, but I remembered something I once read online about silence being a response, not an absence. That idea stayed with me longer than I wanted it to. The next evening I came back earlier and the van was gone. I felt foolish for being relieved. After going out with friends, I returned late and noticed the house felt too still. When I finally lay down, I heard dull thumps and soft movement inside the walls. I pressed my ear against the drywall and felt vibration. When I knocked, the sound stopped instantly, as if whatever was there understood correction. I walked into the living room and saw the white van had returned. Empty this time. My chest tightened as I circled the house and found the crawlspace door cracked open with the lock broken. I leaned inside the darkness and heard pebbles shift. Then footsteps, human and close. Something I once read warned never to look twice. I slammed the door and ran, knowing something had begun. I locked myself inside and called the police with shaking hands, trying to explain without sounding crazy. While I waited, I kept thinking about strange posts I once read on a forgotten forum. People talking about houses being tested slowly. Sounds meant to measure reactions. Spaces meant to be entered without permission. When the officers arrived, they searched the crawl space and found cut marks in the ceiling beams. Careful lines like someone had practiced patience there. They asked about the van, but I had nothing useful to give. No plates, no faces, just a shape that felt wrong. After they left, I could not sleep. I stayed awake listening to every shift of the house. I remembered reading another rule late one night. Never acknowledge the watcher twice. I had already broken that rule without knowing it. And the silence afterward felt heavy, like something had been postponed rather than stopped. Days passed and nothing happened, but the routine felt altered. My runs ended earlier, and my lights stayed on longer. Sometimes I thought I heard movement under the floor again, but it always stopped when I focused. I started to feel like attention itself was part of the process. Like whatever had been there was learning when I noticed and when I did not. I did not realize it then, but fear had become the signal. Eventually the van never returned and life pretended to normalize. Yet I kept checking the crawlspace door every night before bed. I stopped reading forums and deleted old bookmarks, but certain phrases stayed in my head about unfinished steps and interrupted sequences. Sometimes at the same hour each night the house creaked in the same pattern, and I wondered if leaving had been expected, and staying had disrupted something planned. Even now I cannot explain why that house feels marked in my memory, like a place where something almost crossed fully inside. I moved out not long after, but the dreams followed me. Narrow spaces and measured breathing. I never learned who was in that crawl space or why. Only that whatever they were doing depended on quiet and timing, and my fear may have been the final piece they needed. Months later, I stopped running entirely. Not because I was afraid of the dark, but because the dark felt scheduled. Like it expected me at a certain hour. Sometimes at night I would wake at the same minute without knowing why. My phone screen would glow 11:37 every time. I once read that repetition is a kind of invitation, and I hated how my body seemed to remember something my mind wanted buried. I tried to explain the feeling to my sister Marissa, but the words never landed right. How do you describe being observed without eyes? The house itself felt complicit. Vents clicked in patterns and pipes groaned like responses. I stopped fixing small things because altering the structure felt wrong, almost disrespectful, like there were rules tied to the space, and I had already broken enough of them by noticing. One night while packing boxes, I found shallow scratches on the inside of the crawlspace door. Marks I swear were not there before. thin and uneven like someone testing pressure. I remembered a deleted thread about preparation stages. How interruption does not end intent, it only delays it. Standing there, I felt the same calm dread as before, like the moment just before someone knocks softly instead of loudly. After I moved, the dreams intensified, tight spaces and measured breaths, always stopping before something reached me. I stopped searching for explanations, because every answer felt like another step forward. I learned that some experiences lose power only when unnamed. Still, certain hours make my skin prickle, especially late Fridays. The same night it began, when silence feels arranged rather than natural. I tell myself it ended because I left, but deep down I know leaving was not part of the rule set. It felt more like a pause than an escape. Sometimes when I lie awake, I imagine that crawl space empty but waiting, like a mouth that closed before finishing a word. And I wonder if places remember us longer than we remember them, especially when something was meant to be completed. After settling into a new place, I tried rebuilding habits slowly. Different streets, different hours, different lights. But my body still reacted the same way to certain sounds. Scraping metal or distant footsteps would freeze me instantly. I kept remembering a comment I once saw about how the first location is never the goal. It is only where attention is learned. And that thought made unfamiliar rooms feel just as exposed. Sometimes, while half asleep, I felt the urge to check beneath the floor. Even though there was nothing there, I would stand still listening for a response that never came. The absence felt intentional, like a held breath. I realized then that whatever had been under that house was not desperate, it was patient. And patience feels far worse than urgency when you are the thing being measured. I stopped telling people about it, because the story sounded incomplete even to me. No face, no confrontation, just preparation. Yet the lack of resolution felt like the point. I once read that rituals fail only when fully exposed. Partial interruption leaves residue. Standing alone at night, I sometimes feel like the residue moved with me, quietly attached, waiting for the same conditions to return. Every now and then I catch myself checking locks twice, then stopping because something in me says not to. Like I'm being tested on compliance rather than security. That feeling makes no sense logically, but logic has very little power when memory takes over. Especially memory tied to fear and silence. I have learned that fear does not fade. It only learns how to stay quiet. I do not drive past that old house anymore, but I know the crawl space is still there. Empty or not, I cannot say. Sometimes late at night I imagine someone else living there now, following a routine they think is harmless, unaware of how routines look from the outside, unaware that attention can linger, and that some things do not need to finish to remain active. I used to escape to our family place in Arapahoe National Forest, Colorado whenever I needed quiet. My name is Daniel now, and I went alone most times, hunting gear packed, phone barely useful. The house sat far from everything. No neighbors, no noise. The kind of isolation people romanticize. I had been there dozens of times before. But that summer felt different from the start, like arriving late to something already in motion. I parked on the grass near the deck and unlocked the door using the keypad. We never used keys up there. Inside smelled like dust and pine. I turned on the power and water, then cleaned out old traps left behind. While unpacking, I remembered a private message I once read about remote places being ideal for observation. Not because of danger, but because of control. Nothing interrupts the pattern when you're alone. As the sun dropped, I began setting up my hunting gear from the bath closet. Everything felt routine until I heard laughter outside. Faint at first, then clearer. Children laughing in the woods. It made no sense given the distance and isolation. I stood still listening, confused more than afraid. A strange detail stuck with me. The laughter never overlapped. It repeated in cycles like a recording played carefully. I opened the back door and followed the sound into the trees. Each step felt measured. The laughter stayed the same distance away no matter how far I went. Eventually I stopped and turned back. Not tired but uneasy. It felt like I was being guided rather than chased. Later I would remember something I read about boundaries being tested slowly. Never crossed outright until permission is implied. That night I slept lightly with windows open, the forest air cold and restless. I kept waking at the same intervals without knowing why, my body reacting before my thoughts could catch up. I told myself it was nothing, just unfamiliar noise and isolation. But deep down I felt watched in a way that did not feel hostile, more like evaluation, as if the land itself was paying attention. The next morning I climbed into the hunting tower my dad built years ago. The woods stretched endlessly, and everything felt normal again until the laughter returned. Same tone, same rhythm, same distance. I felt a chill despite the sun. I remembered a rule I once saw mentioned online about acknowledgement creating permission. Unsure what to do, I called my dad and he told me to scare them off if I saw them, his voice steady while mine was not. I fired a warning shot into the air, and the laughter stopped instantly. Not fading or running away, just gone. The silence afterward felt too clean, like a switch being flipped. I climbed down knowing the hunt was over for the day. Walking back, I kept replaying the sound in my head, realizing it had never echoed. Something real should have echoed out there, and that detail would not leave me alone. That evening I stayed inside feeling a pressure I could not name. My head ached, and the air felt thick. I left the windows open again, hoping it would help. Sometime after 11 the laughter came back louder than before, close enough to feel intrusive. I sat up in bed listening and felt a sense of repetition, like I had failed a step and something was restarting the sequence without explanation. I grabbed my rifle and a flashlight, telling myself I would only scare them off. Stepping outside, the laughter swelled suddenly, overwhelming and sharp. Something dropped near my feet and clattered on the ground. When I shined the light, I saw an old speaker playing the laughter on a loop. My hands shook as I threw it back into the woods, realizing then the sound had never belonged to children at all. As I scanned the trees, I thought I saw a figure standing just beyond the beam. Not moving, not reacting. I fired into the air and shouted a threat I barely recognized as my own. Then ran back inside, locking everything. My chest burned and my ears rang. I remembered reading that once the illusion drops, the test ends quickly, and I knew without understanding why that staying any longer was no longer an option. Inside the house, I shut every curtain and stood still, listening. The forest went quiet in a way that felt deliberate, not natural. My thoughts raced back to a deleted post about confrontation always being the final mistake, that the real purpose is reaction, not outcome. I stood there breathing slowly, wondering if fear itself was what had been needed. The laughter gone now, replaced by a waiting silence that felt heavier than sound. While packing my bag, I heard a dull smear against the living room window. Slow and careful, I did not approach right away because something told me not to look too quickly. When I finally pulled the curtain aside, there was writing on the glass made with something dark and wet. I could not bring myself to read it, understanding that meaning comes from attention, and I refused to give it that satisfaction. I finished packing with shaking hands and grabbed my rifle. Every movement felt loud despite the quiet. Before leaving, I hesitated at the door, feeling a strange pull to stay. Like leaving early would break an unspoken rule. I ignored it and ran for the truck, starting it before the engine fully turned over, my instincts screaming that whatever had started was not meant to end there. I drove for hours without stopping, calling my dad once my hand steadied enough to hold the phone. He told me I did the right thing, and that nothing in that house was worth my life. Still, I kept checking the mirrors, expecting headlights or movement in the trees. Even far from the forest, I felt followed. Not physically, but in memory, like something had taken note of my response. The next day we returned together, and the house looked untouched. The writing gone, the speaker missing, no signs of forced entry. It felt staged clean and intentional, like evidence being removed after a trial ended. We stayed briefly, then left, and I understood then that whatever happened there did not need to repeat itself, because it had already learned enough from me the first time. After leaving Colorado, I tried to rationalize everything as stress or isolation, but certain details refused to fade. The exact timing of the laughter, the way it repeated without variation. I remembered something I once read about conditioning through rhythm, how repetition can soften resistance. Weeks later, I still woke at night expecting sound that never came, and that absence felt less like relief and more like something unfinished. I stopped going back to the forest after that, even with others, because being there made my thoughts slow and circular, like the place encouraged reflection rather than action. Sometimes I wondered if the land itself was neutral, and it was people who brought intent with them. That idea scared me more than strangers because intent travels. It does not need to stay where it was first expressed. Once in a while, I still think about the speaker and how carefully it had been placed. Not thrown, not rushed. I questioned whether it was meant to scare me or simply to see how I would respond. Fear, anger, hesitation. Each reaction felt like data, and the idea that someone might collect those responses without ever needing to reveal themselves still makes my skin tighten when I remember that night. I never asked my dad if he had seen anything unusual before or after my visit. Some questions feel like doors you should not reopen. I learned that understanding is not always safer than ignorance, especially when the pattern already exists. Sometimes the safest thing is to let the shape remain incomplete, even if it leaves you wondering whether you are only one part of something larger. To this day, certain sounds pull me back there instantly. Recorded laughter muffled by distance, wind moving through trees at night. I cannot say what wanted my attention or why it chose that place and time, only that something observed me carefully and then withdrew. Not defeated, but satisfied enough, and that feels worse than any clear ending ever could. I was 14 when it happened, and my parents had just started trusting me enough to leave the house for a weekend. My name then was Lucas, and I felt proud of the responsibility. The first night went fine with friends over and noise filling the rooms. The second night, I stayed out late and walked home alone. Halfway there, I noticed a car moving slowly behind me, matching every turn without passing. At first, I told myself I was being dramatic, but the headlights flashed once, then again. My chest tightened and I started walking faster. The car slowed with me. Something about that felt intentional, like a rule being followed carefully. I remembered a warning I once read about never letting fear change your pace. But I did anyway, turning my walk into a run as my heart hammered. I sprinted the rest of the way home and slammed the door shut behind me, locking it just as a car stopped outside. Through the window I saw a man get out and rush toward the house. The doorbell rang hard, then pounding followed, each hit louder than the last. I felt small and exposed, like the house itself was too thin to protect me from whatever intention had followed me there. I ran to my room in the lower level and tried calling my parents, but they did not answer. The knocking shifted from the front door to my window, as if whoever was outside knew exactly where I was. I screamed for them to go away, and they shouted something back, but I could not make it out. My hand shook so badly I almost dropped the phone while dialing emergency services. While whispering to the dispatcher, I heard the man outside yell that someone had followed me and might already be inside the house. Those words froze me in place, the idea settling too easily in my mind. Moments later I heard footsteps inside moving slowly down the hallway, each door opening one by one, the sound stopping just outside my parents' bedroom as the handle began to turn. I hid in the closet, holding my breath while the person on the other side of the door began hitting it hard, each impact shaking the frame. I stayed silent because the dispatcher told me noise would only help them. The banging stopped suddenly, and the quiet that followed felt wrong, like the pause before a decision. I remember thinking that if the door opened, the house itself had failed me. Still on the phone, I heard glass break somewhere in the house, sharp and final. The dispatcher told me police were close. My body felt numb as fear turned into something colder. I whispered that the back door might be open, and that someone was definitely inside. It felt strange narrating my own danger like instructions, as if saying it out loud made it more real and harder to escape. Minutes later I heard voices outside and footsteps retreating quickly. When police entered through the front, I finally came out of hiding, shaking so badly I could barely stand. The man who had been outside banging on the windows was there too. Calm but urgent, he explained that he had seen an older man following me home, hiding behind bushes, matching my movements carefully. The officers checked the house and found the back door glass smashed, unlocked from the inside, nothing stolen, nothing disturbed. That detail terrified me more than theft would have, because it meant intent had not been about objects. I remembered something I once read about targets being chosen quietly, and how the real danger is when nothing is taken because observation was the only goal. I called my mom and she stayed on speaker while the police reassured her. My parents drove back that night and an officer stayed outside the house until morning. Later I learned the man who warned me had not hesitated, because he had seen the same pattern before. Following, not rushing. Waiting, not acting. I realized then how close I had come to being part of something unfinished. After that night, the house never felt like a shelter again. Even in daylight, I sensed corners holding on to shadows longer than they should. My parents tried to restore normal routines, but routine itself now felt dangerous. I kept thinking about how the man outside knew where I was without seeing me, like my movement had announced itself. Later I remembered reading that being predictable is a kind of signal. Sleep became difficult because every sound felt intentional. Pipes settling, floors creaking, wind brushing the siding. I would lie still, counting seconds between noises, convinced something would repeat at the wrong interval. The dispatcher had told me silence was safer. But silence felt like invitation now, as if the house was listening back, waiting for me to move first. I never saw the older man who followed me, and that absence bothered me more than a face would have. No description meant no endpoint, just a shape in my mind. I remembered a message from a private forum about incomplete encounters attaching themselves to memory. How the mind keeps replaying them to search for missing steps, even when you do not want it to. For weeks I avoided walking alone and changed my routes constantly. But the feeling did not fade. It adapted. Sometimes I felt watched even in crowds, as if attention once learned does not unlearn isoline. I wondered if that night had been a test of awareness rather than strength, and whether passing it simply meant surviving without understanding what had really been asked of me. Years later, I still think about the timing of everything. The flashing headlights, the knock, the footsteps stopping at the door. None of it felt rushed. It followed a sequence too clean to be random. I have learned to trust that feeling now. The sense that some dangers do not want chaos. They want control. And control requires patience more than force. Even now I still replay that night when things slowed down, wondering if the warning saved me, or simply delayed something. Sometimes I think about patterns, and how attention moves quietly from place to place. If you are listening to this on Mr. Rituals, you already understand why some stories are told softly and left unfinished. Make sure you are subscribed, because some rules only reveal themselves once. I grew older and learned how easily life stacks distractions on top of fear. Schoolwork, noise, friends. But the memory never left. It only settled deeper. Certain sounds still pull me back instantly. Footsteps that pause. Knocking that waits. Silence that feels arranged. I never talk about it openly because saying it out loud feels like acknowledgement. And I learned early that acknowledgement can be permission. Sometimes I wonder about the man who followed me, and whether he ever finished what he started somewhere else. The thought makes my stomach tighten, because patterns rarely belong to one place or one person. They move quietly, looking for familiarity. I cannot explain why, but I know that night changed how I moved through the world. Slower, less predictable, like I'm avoiding steps in a sequence I never agreed to. There are moments late at night when I feel the same alertness settle over me without cause, my body responding before my mind catches up. I tell myself it is instinct, not fear, but I'm not always sure. Some experiences do not end. They just lose context, becoming background noise that waits for the right conditions to rise again. And that thought keeps me awake longer than I admit. I never found out who that man was or why he chose that night. And maybe that is the point. Some encounters are meant to remain unresolved so the connection stays intact, like an open circuit. I have learned not to look for answers anymore, because whatever was interrupted back then felt patient. And patience does not disappear just because time has passed.